When looking at religious maps of the world, there are so many things that can be extremely misleading. One of the most important things that people miss when looking at these maps would be population density. In the map you see before you on the screen, the areas that are colored in turquoise or blue have the same population as the small area colored in red. This does not mean that the entirety of the world is empty except for Southeast Asia, but rather that parts of the world are extremely populated, some would say overpopulated, and that other parts of the world are underpopulated. So when you see some kind of a religious map where you see massive areas that are colored Orthodox Christian or Sunni Muslim, that may not actually be the case, and the size of the area may be misleading to those who don't understand population density. The northern half of Africa is geographically larger than India, but has a significantly lower population, since the vast majority of it is empty land. Chad, Niger, Libya, half of Sudan, most of the size of Egypt, Mali, are all mostly empty countries, even the southern half of Algeria. Much of Brazil, all of Canada, Alaska, Greenland, and Iceland, and most of Scandinavia are also empty. The vast majority of Asian Russia is empty, and Kazakhstan, one of the largest countries by geography, has a minuscule population and a very small population density. China, even though a massive area, large parts of Western China which are not ethnically Han Chinese are empty. The central part, as well as the great mountain region known as Tibet, have a very low population density compared to what is known as the Han bubble, and especially compared to one of the most populated areas in the world, northeastern India. Likewise, New Zealand and Australia are also mostly empty. Australia is almost the size of Europe, yet less than 30 million people live there. Canada is larger than Europe, excluding Russia, and larger than the United States. Yet, it is also mostly empty. Likewise, Greenland, this enormous island, the largest one in the world, is also mostly empty. And the central part of South America is empty, as well as the cone of Chile and Argentina. So when we see exaggerated maps where we may see something like the Christian world, and you see an enormous North America colored Christian, this is inaccurate, because that massive amount of land may be misleading. Here's an average projected map. I've taken the liberty of coloring Russia, Greenland, Canada, the entirety of the continent of Africa, and the continent of South America. In this map, Greenland looks the size of South America, and Canada dwarfs South America as well, and Africa. Russia is larger than either of them, and absolutely dwarfs the rest of Asia. However, this is known as the Mercator or other types of projections, which is why it's called a projected map. We look at an actual map, which is much more realistic, with the same exact color grading. We can see that Russia, while certainly the largest single country in the world, is much more long than it is tall. It does not dwarf the rest of Asia, and it is not larger than the continent of Africa, nor is it significantly different in size from Canada or South America. Greenland, likewise, though still quite a large island, about the size of Western Europe, is no longer larger than South America or the size of most of Africa. In this map, we can see population density not in terms of sparsity, but what countries have the same amount of population. So, green for 120 to 140 million. We have Mexico, Egypt, Ethiopia, Russia, Japan, and Bangladesh. Bangladesh is minuscule, the size of many states in the United States of America, yet it has a greater population than Russia. Egypt, even though it's about the same size as Ethiopia, is extremely densely packed along the Nile River, and the actual land being used is primarily empty. Russia is massive, many times larger than Japan or Bangladesh combined, or any of the other ones combined, yet it is still in that same population bracket. Likewise, in the 200 to 230 million bracket, we have Brazil, an enormous country, followed by Nigeria, a country that's smaller than Egypt, and smaller by many times than Russia, and yet it still has well over 200 million people. And in 275 to 340 million, we have the United States of America and Indonesia. Indonesia, however, even though it looks like it's quite large in terms of its geography. We'll see in the next map how much of it is also empty land. And then finally, the only countries that are above 1,200 million, or 1.2 billion, are India and China. The same applies to South America. The vast majority of the continent looks empty in this map. That's because in the northern and central half, you see the Amazon jungle, which is much larger than just a part of Brazil, which is what most people think. Rather, the Amazon jungle the Amazon rainforest takes up a significant part of Ecuador, Venezuela, Colombia, Guyana, Suriname, and Brazil. Then the cone of Chile and Argentina is also empty. Look at the United States. Most of the Northwest is not very populated, and Canada is almost entirely empty. You can also see that Western Europe, despite being geographically small on the other maps, once we adjust it to a proper projected size, has a much bigger population and a much better population density than most of the world. Other than India and China, there are not many regions that can boast they have the population density and size of Western and Central and Northern Europe. Which is why, even though Europe was never geographically larger than Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the New World, it contained much of the development of civilization because of two reasons. Number one, the population density that we already brought up, and number two, the fact that it existed on the Mediterranean and served as a place to trade with all the other great budding Mediterranean civilizations at the start of human civilization itself. Here's another map, even though quite blurry, of population density, which can show an even better idea of where people live. The purple are extremely densely packed, and the blue is absolutely densely packed. There are only a few blue areas in the entire map, and they are primarily in Southeast Asia and parts of China as well. The northeastern part of India, including parts of Pakistan, which is northwest, and the northeastern Bangladesh, west and east Bangladesh, and leading up to the Himalayas, is extremely densely populated. No other place in the world is that densely populated except for the north of Egypt. And finally, another map to show you the climates of the world and perhaps why so many of them seem to be empty. When you look at the Sahara Desert, you can see clearly that it's primarily desert. It says xeric shrubland and arid desert for the vast majority of it, and that's why barely anybody lives here. You can actually see, based on climate alone, where people live. Here in the northern half of Africa, as I said, the most of the population lives in these purple Mediterranean areas. When we go to the Arabian Peninsula, even though it is all primarily desert, the darker, harsher arid desert almost nobody lives in, which is known as Rub al-Khali, or the empty quarter. Rather, most of the population of Saudi Arabia lives in the northeastern coast on the Gulf, or in the western half. The same applies to the rest of the Middle East. Much of Iraq and Syria are completely empty, even though they aren't as extreme desert as North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. Then when we look at the coast of the Levant, Lebanon, Palestine, and Zionist Israel have a massive population density due to the fact that they are a Mediterranean climate. It's important when looking at maps of religion that we're aware of the different climates in the world, the population densities, and where all these things come from. One thing to look at again, before I forget, is that when you look at Indonesia, for example, even though it is geographically large because it covers so many thousands of different islands, it is about the same size as the United States if you include the water areas. The vast majority of the population actually lives in an island called Java. That's where there's over 140 million people. The island of Borneo, even though large in size, is much more sparsely populated. And people might not realize that based on the size of Indonesia and the prominence of Borneo. But the fact is that not that many people live there compared to the island of Java. Likewise with China and India. India is one of the only countries in the world which is almost entirely populated evenly. There are some areas that are much more, but it's one of the only areas in the world where the entire country is populated. There are no empty quarters in India, and that is why they have so many people. Another argument when looking at these maps of population density is that it is clear that the West is actually not overpopulated. Latin America is definitely not overpopulated, and even North America, the United States, much of it is empty other than the coasts. When we look at Canada, it's completely empty. There could be tens of millions of more people that live there. But the thing is, the kind of people that are fear-mongering about migration don't seem to realize that the same places that they're talking about replacing the West have a much worse population density than the West. The vast majority of migrants going to Europe are not Egyptians. They're actually coming from Morocco and Algeria, which have a much worse population density than France, Germany, and Italy. Nigeria is the only place in West Africa that even holds a candle to European population density. In terms of the Islamic population, the reason it has grown so much is due to industrialization and globalization. Most of the areas where the Muslim world is are actually not suitable to having a massive population. They're quite sparse areas, and that's how it was historically, other than South Asia, of course. So when you're looking at Islamic Central Asia, especially Islamic Africa, North Africa, and the Middle East, the populations were never enormous. They quadrupled and even quintupled in size due to industrialization and globalization, to a point where it became completely out of control. And a lot of those are stabilizing now. People wonder, how did the Islamic birth rate catch up to the Christian populace? It was due to industrialization. The Christians, which for a long time primarily meant Europe, had been industrialized far longer, and they were industrialized at a different rate than what is known as, quote, the third or second world. Thank you guys for watching.